In 1975, Goat Island became New Zealand's first marine reserve.
In 1965, the seafloor at Goat Island Bay was bare gray rock, scoured clean, carpeted with black spiny urchins. Nothing moved. The fishermen working above it called it a normal reef because no one alive had ever seen it any other way. Then one man spent 12 years fighting for permission to do absolutely nothing to 5 square kilometers of that coast. No fishing, no taking, ever.
Goat Island in the Hauraki Gulf. And the reefs are alive with fish, like nowhere else around mainland New Zealand.
What grew back turned a dead reef into a forest, and turned New Zealand into the country the rest of the world copied. This is the story of the single word that did it. The man who would not negotiate. It started with a cup of tea. In 1965, in a wooden building on the coast at Lee, Bill Ballantyne invited the local commercial fishermen into the university's marine laboratory and put a proposal to them. He wanted a stretch of coast centered on Goat Island, closed to all fishing and all collecting. No line fishing, no spear fishing, no hooking a crayfish out from under a ledge, no prying rock oysters off the shore at low tide. Nothing taken, nothing removed, permanently. Roughly half the room said that sounded reasonable. The other half told him they would kill him first. Ballantyne's own recollection was that the threat was delivered as a joke, but only about halfway. He could still quote the wording 50 years later, which tells you something about how it was said. These were men whose fathers had fished the same reef. They understood exactly what he was describing, a piece of ocean where they would no longer be allowed to work. One of them put the objection in terms nobody in the room could argue with. Their families had taken fish off that coast for generations, and now a newcomer with a clipboard wanted to write them off it. It was not an unreasonable thing to say. The men in that room were not vandals. They were working people being asked by someone who did not fish to accept a permanent loss on the strength of a theory about what the seabed used to look like. Ballantyne had no evidence to offer them. That was the entire problem. The evidence could only exist after they agreed. What made the proposal radical was not its size. 5 square kilometers of shallow reef is nothing on a map. What made it radical was that nowhere on Earth had it been done. Countries had fishing regulations, closed seasons, minimum sizes, gear restrictions, licensing, quotas, patrol boats. What no country had was a stretch of coast where nothing at all could be taken, forever, by anybody, for any purpose. To the fishermen in the hut that afternoon, this was theft dressed up as science, and Ballantyne was not offering them a middle ground. He never would. A partial closure, he argued, was scientifically worthless, which meant the only version of the idea worth fighting for was the version everybody in the room objected to. He was not a natural revolutionary. He was more likely to be found counting mollusks on a rock than shouting at a public meeting. But he had one conviction he would not trade away, and it came from what he and his colleagues had seen when they put their heads underwater in the bay outside. The gray desert nobody could see. Goat Island Bay looked like every other bay on that coast. Clear water, rocky shoreline, waves working over the reef. From the surface, there was nothing to suggest anything was missing. Underwater, it was close to dead. Swim out over it, and the first thing you noticed was how far you could see and how little there was to look at. Gray rock in every direction, flat, uniform. Urchins packed shoulder to shoulder across it, thousands of them. Black spines shifting very slightly in the swell, and otherwise still. No canopy overhead, no shadow. No small fish darting into cover, because there was no cover to dart into. Nothing moved except the water. Divers described it as a kind of silence, which is a strange word to use underwater, but it is the right one. A living reef is busy. This was a car park. Scientists have a term for it. An urchin barren. Kilometer after kilometer of gray stone and black spines, biologically impoverished, structurally flat, and extremely stable, because once a barren establishes it, tends to keep itself that way. What should have been there was kelp, dense stands of large brown seaweed, waving in the swell, the structural backbone of a temperate reef. Kelp forests on that coast work the way a forest works on land. They shelter juvenile fish. They anchor food chains. They give a reef its complexity and its hiding places. There was almost none of it. The urchin is called kina, and it is not an invader or a pest. It belongs there. In a functioning system, it lives at modest densities, held in check by the 2 large reef predators that eat it. snapper, and spiny rock lobster, known locally as crayfish. But snapper and crayfish had been fished down along that coast for decades. Remove the predators and the arithmetic changes. The quina multiplied. As their numbers rose, they did what urchins do. They grazed. They ate the young kelp before it could establish. They ate the sporelings. They ate the reef's future, and then they sat on the cleared rock in enormous numbers because nothing was left to control them and nothing was left to compete for. Here is the detail Ballantine could not stop turning over. The fishermen working above that reef did not describe it as damaged. They described it as normal, and from their point of view, they were being perfectly honest. The barren had formed before any of them started fishing. Their fathers had fished a coast that was already changing. Nobody in the district had a personal memory of a kelp forest at Goat Island, so nobody experienced its absence as a loss. An ecosystem does not have to look ruined to be ruined. It only has to have been that way longer than the people looking at it can remember. Which raised the obvious question. If nobody alive knew what the bay was supposed to look like, how could anybody prove what had been lost? And there is a harder version of that question, waiting further into this story. Not whether the loss could be proved, but whether a reef nobody remembered could ever be brought back at all. Subscribe, because the answer took 30 years, and it starts with something that looked exactly like failure. The missing control. Ballantine's argument was one sentence long, and he repeated it for the rest of his life in almost the same words. There were thousands of places on the New Zealand coast where fishing was allowed. There were 0 places where it was not. Marine science globally had never had a control. Every fishery study ever conducted anywhere in the world was measuring the same narrow thing. The difference between heavy fishing and slightly less heavy fishing. Different quotas, different mesh sizes, different closed months. All of it variation inside a single condition. Nobody had ever measured the difference between fishing and no fishing because nowhere on the planet had a stretch of productive coast been left completely alone long enough to compare. The idea itself had not started with him. In 1965, Val Chapman, a botanist at the University of Auckland, floated the notion that a marine reserve should be established around the new laboratory, on the practical grounds that a research station is useless if the reef outside its windows keeps getting scraped flat. Chapman raised it. Ballantine picked it up and never put it down. What followed was not a scientific project. It was a 12-year campaign of letters, lectures, submissions, and arguments. He spoke to underwater clubs and diving federations, which turned out to be his most reliable allies, because divers were the only people who had actually seen the barren with their own eyes. He appeared before local councils. He wrote to government departments. He made the same case over and over to audiences that were often indifferent and sometimes hostile. And he ran straight into a wall that no amount of persuasion could get through. In 1965, New Zealand had no marine reserve law. Not a weak one, not a restrictive one, none. There was no legal instrument in the country that could create the thing he was asking for, and no framework under which anybody could even apply. Before he could win the argument, he had to get Parliament to invent the mechanism. 12 years and 6 hours at a kitchen table. Parliament passed the Marine Reserves Act in 1971. 6 years after the first proposal, New Zealand had a legal pathway for no-take marine reserves. That was the abstract victory. It did not deliver the reserve. Ballantine's application under the new act was rejected. He applied again. The second application then sat in government offices for another 4 years, moving between departments, attracting objections, generating correspondence. The opposition was not really about biology. It was about a district's relationship with its own coastline and about the precedent. If a stretch of sea could be closed here, it could be closed anywhere. He had no leverage of any kind, no political office, no funding to withhold, no institutional weight beyond a small field station, and a British training that carried very little in a Northland fishing village. What he had was persistence and a refusal to say yes to anything smaller. Late in that process, the country's Attorney General drove north to Lee in person and spent roughly 6 hours in Ballantine's kitchen trying to talk him out of the no-take clause. Sit with that for a moment. The senior law officer of the government gave most of a working day to one stubborn scientist over 5 square kilometers of shallow reef. The offer was pragmatic and, on the face of it, generous. Accept a small compromise and the reserve goes through immediately. A little rod fishing, a little crayfishing. just enough to keep the local community on side and take the political sting out of it. Ballantyne would get his reserve, the government would get its piece, and everybody could go home. He refused. The whole point of the thing was the word no. When the Attorney General left, Ballantyne did something that says more about the campaign than any of the paperwork. He walked up the hill to the farmer who owned the land the marine laboratory stood on, the man whose goodwill the entire operation depended on, and asked whether he still had his support. The farmer told him to stop worrying about it and get on with it. In late 1975, the government gazetted the reserve. It was formally opened on the 26th of October, 1977, 12 years after Chapman first raised the idea. Its official name was the Cape Rodney to Okakari Point Marine Reserve. Almost nobody has ever called it that. It covered around 500 hectares of shallow coast, and on paper, it now belonged to nothing but the fish. The local paper summed up the district's feelings in one sentence. There was nothing to do at Goat Island Bay anymore. Ballantyne repeated that line, dryly, for decades. The implication as he read it was that no red-blooded New Zealander would ever bother visiting a beach where they were not permitted to kill something. Then came the part of the story that nearly broke him, and it had nothing to do with the fishermen. The years when nothing happened, the reserve was in place, the rule was absolute, and for the first several years, the bay did nothing. Divers went out. They counted the same reefs, they found the same urchins. The barrens sat there, gray and black and unbothered. The kelp did not come back. Species that had vanished did not reappear. If you had swum the bay in 1980, then swum an unprotected bay 10 kilometers down the coast, you would have struggled to tell which one had an act of parliament behind it. It was Ballantyne's own colleagues, rather than his opponents, who found this hardest to sit with. Scientists had spent 12 years being told a no-take reserve was an unreasonable demand. Now they had one. And the visible result was a bay that looked exactly like every other bay. The reason, understood properly, is the most important lesson in the whole story. The recovery was never going to start with the seaweed. Seaweed was the symptom. It had to start with the thing that had been removed first, and that recovery was invisible from the surface. With line fishing banned, snappers stopped being pulled out of the bay. The few that remained were no longer harvested, so they did the one thing a fish population does when nothing catches it. They aged, they grew. Snapper that would ordinarily have been landed at legal size instead kept going, year after year, some approaching a meter in length. Rock lobster did the same, accumulating in crevices and under ledges, reaching sizes the local fleet had effectively removed from the coast decades earlier. None of that was happening in plain sight. It was happening inside a population in the form of older and bigger animals rather than a visibly different landscape. And size is the mechanism, not a detail. A small snapper cannot eat an adult quina. A large one can crush it with the heavy teeth at the back of its jaw. A small lobster cannot pull a large urchin out from between two rocks and open it. A large lobster can. What 12 years of legal argument had bought was not a fish sanctuary. It was the return of predators large enough to do a job that had not been done on that reef in living memory. The population had to cross a threshold before anything visible would change. For years, nobody knew whether it ever would. Then the barrens started to shrink. The forest comes back. Once the numbers of large snapper and large crayfish passed a certain density, they began doing what they had evolved to do on that reef. They ate sea urchins. The change did not arrive as a wave. It arrived at the edges. The barren began contracting inward, patch by patch, as grazing pressure fell where the predators were most active. On every square of rock the urchins vacated, something happened almost immediately. Seaweed took hold. Sporelings that had been eaten for decades survived long enough to establish. Small algae first, then larger stands, then structure. It took close to 30 years for the kelp forests of Goat Island Bay to return fully. 30 years is a long time in a human career, and no time at all in the life of a reef. But once they came back, the bay was unrecognizable. Fine, feathery brown algae moving in the current. Dense cover where there had been bare stone. Juvenile fish with somewhere to hide, which meant more juveniles surviving, which meant more adults. Dive surveys began recording species that had not been noted on those reefs in living memory. The numbers, when they were finally measured properly, were not marginal. In 2003, Dr. Tony Willis and Dr. Russell Babcock at the University of Auckland ran baited underwater video surveys inside and outside the reserve. Legal-sized snapper came out nearly 28 times more abundant inside the marine reserve than in the fished waters next door. The precise figure was 27.7, not 28% more, 28 times as many. Seaweed productivity in the bay rose by 58% between 1978 and 1996. Rock lobster density inside the reserve ran 4 to 5 times higher than outside it. And here is the part that has made economists pay as much attention as ecologists. None of that cost the public anything beyond signs, some monitoring, and the occasional prosecution. There was no hatchery. Nothing was released, nothing was replanted, no habitat was engineered. Governments around the world spend billions on fish stock restoration through breeding programs, quota systems, size limits, and enforcement patrols. At Goat Island, the entire intervention was the absence of a single human activity, applied consistently over time. A whole coastal ecosystem rebuilt itself, using nothing except being left alone. Which brings the story back to the men in the hut, because their reaction to all of this was not the one anybody predicted. The fence line. Recreational and commercial fishermen began fishing deliberately, and hard, right up against the reserve boundary. Marker buoys appeared in a ring around the edge of the protected zone, holding crayfish pots positioned precisely at the legal limit. Boats worked the line. The reason was straightforward. The reserve had become so productive that its surplus was moving outward. Adult fish and lobster dispersing across the boundary, larvae carried into surrounding waters. Ecologists call it spillover. The fishermen did not need the term. They could see where the fish were, so the same men who had promised to kill him for it were now having some of their best days on the water, working the fence line of the thing they had tried to stop. Ballantyne, asked about it in later years, said essentially that this was what he had predicted all along. He put it more sharply as the decades went on. Virtually none of the predictions the reserve's opponents made in 1977 came true. The village of Lee did not die. The local fishermen were not ruined. Access to the coast was not lost. What happened instead was something nobody in the district had imagined, least of all the newspaper that declared there was nothing to do at Goat Island Bay anymore. More than 300,000 people a year now travel to that bay. They come with masks and snorkels and school groups and cameras. They come to look at fish rather than to catch them. It became one of the best-known dive and snorkel sites in New Zealand, and the local economy that opponents feared would collapse was reshaped instead around people arriving to see a reef that works. That is the local story. On its own, it would be a good one. It is not why this reserve is called the country's greatest conservation success. Why this one is called the greatest. New Zealand has larger protected areas. It has more charismatic ones. Offshore island sanctuaries, kakapo programs, predator-free projects that have brought birds back from single-digit populations. Measured in hectares, or in species pulled off the edge of extinction, 500 hectares of shallow reef north of Auckland is a modest thing. It outranks all of them for one reason. It is the only one that changed how the rest of the world manages the sea. The Marine Reserves Act, 1971, the law Ballantyne spent 6 years pushing Parliament to pass, did not stop at one bay. It has since been used to create 43 further no-take marine reserves around New Zealand. Cape Rodney to Okakari Point was the first. It is now one of 44. The framework built to protect a single reef outside a research station became the country's entire mechanism for marine protection. Then it left the country. The same model, a fully protected area with no extraction at all, monitored against fished reference sites, has been applied in Australia, in California, in the Philippines, in South Africa, around the Mediterranean, and in the Kermadec Ocean Sanctuary north of New Zealand's own waters. Professor Simon Thrush, director of the University of Auckland's Institute of Marine Science, has said the modern concept of the no-take marine reserve essentially began at Goat Island. Nothing about the original proposal was designed to travel. It was a research station wanting an intact reef outside its own front door, argued for by a man with no power, in a district that mostly resented him for it. It traveled because it produced numbers other countries could not argue with, from the only site on Earth where the single variable was human absence. A clean result from a small bay turned out to be more persuasive than any amount of theory. Every one of those reserves on 4 continents carries some of Ballantyne's fingerprints, and he still would not have called it finished. The baseline nobody has seen. Even after 50 years of complete protection, fish stocks inside Goat Island Bay remain below the levels they would have reached before commercial fishing arrived on that coast. Professor Conrad Pildich, also of the University of Auckland, has made the point directly. The reserve has done extraordinary things, but it is still recovering towards a baseline that essentially nobody alive has ever seen. Read that again. 50 years. The strictest protection any country has ever written into law. Total prohibition, enforced, uninterrupted, through 5 decades of governments and generations. And the bay is still climbing towards a condition no living person can describe from memory. Not a condition that was lost recently. Not something a grandparent could sketch out at a kitchen table. There is no photograph of it. There is no diver's account of it. Whatever the reef at Goat Island looked like before the fishing began, it exists now only as an inference, reconstructed from what a fully recovered system ought to be capable of. The most successful marine reserve in the world is a partial recovery towards something we can only estimate. That is the measure of what was taken out. It is also why Ballantine never treated the reserve as an ending. One reserve, he argued, was never going to be enough. The scale of what humans had removed from the sea was too large for 500 hectares to repair. What he wanted was networks of no-take reserves, large enough and numerous enough to protect entire life cycles and migration routes along every coast in every country. Not a museum piece with a fence around it. A working model that other places would copy, which is exactly what happened, and it still was not enough for him. In one of his last interviews at the age of 78, Ballantine told a reporter that the fundamental purpose of protecting the sea was not to grow more fish for fishermen. It was to let the ocean function as itself, for its own sake. Human benefits, he said, would follow. They always did. But they were not the point. He died a few weeks later, in November 2015, in the same house on the hill above Lee, where he had lived for more than 50 years. From the kitchen window, the window the Attorney General had sat beside, you could see the water he had refused to give up on. There is a photograph, taken by the writer Kennedy Warren, of Bill Ballantine crouched at the tide line on the rocky shore at Goat Island Bay. He is holding an old slide up to the light. The slide shows the same rock, photographed decades earlier. He is comparing what is in front of him now with what was there before, and he is counting mollusks on a single square meter of stone. Behind him, the sea is doing something he never expected to see in his lifetime. Snapper the length of a forearm hanging in clear water a few meters from a public beach, in a bay where they had almost disappeared. He does not turn around to look at them. He already knows they are there. He is checking the shore for the small things, one at a time, the way he did every year of his adult life. If this story surprised you, subscribe, and leave a comment with this. If the single most successful thing New Zealand ever did for its coast cost almost nothing and required only the discipline to leave one bay alone, what is stopping the same rule from being applied to the stretch of coast nearest you? Like the video if it was worth your time.